This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBary. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
Well, you ready to study the book of Daniel tonight? I'm excited about it. We've had a couple of weeks with other things going on with the singing, and then the ladies from the Potter's House were with us. But tonight we're going to be back in Daniel chapter number 2. So if you want to go ahead and turn there. And I want to give just a very, very brief review of where we're at in the book of Daniel, because we've not gotten too far into the book. And for those that might not have been able to be here with us the other nights leading up to this, the book of Daniel is, I think, the most exciting book of prophecy in the entire Old Testament, maybe out of the Old and New Testament. It deals much of it with end times events, things that are still yet to come. And in many ways, it is a parallel in the Old Testament of the book of Revelation in the New Testament, with the prophecies concerning the end times that we're going to see in the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel is 12 chapters long, and you can almost divide it right down the middle. The first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are primarily history. That is, they are stories related to Daniel and his Hebrew companions that are in captivity in Babylon, and some of the events that happened to them and to the king. Not as much prophecy in the first 6 chapters as there are in the latter 6 chapters. When we get to those final 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, it's almost exclusively prophecy concerning the end times. But tonight you're in for a little bit of a treat, because even though we're still in the first 6 chapters, tonight we're going to get our first look at some of the prophecy concerning the end times that's recorded in the book of Daniel, even though we're only at the end of chapter number 2. So you're in for a little bit of a treat in that regard tonight. In chapter 1, we saw that Daniel and his 3 Hebrew companions, whose names have been changed by the Babylonians at this point into Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they all find themselves having been taken captive from Jerusalem, their home, to the land of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city of Jerusalem, took back captives of many of the young people that were part of the royal families, the upper class of the kingdom of Judah, back to Babylon. They've been given new names. The Babylonians changed their names into names that had to do with the Babylonian gods, in the hopes that these Hebrews would forget the God of the Bible and adopt the Babylonian gods. They've started teaching them the language, the Chaldean language of the Babylonians, and teaching them in their classes to change them from being Hebrews to being Babylonians. They are given good jobs. They're well taken care of. And at this point, Daniel and his 3 Hebrew companions, they are with a number of the other Hebrew young people that have been taken back to Babylon, but they're mixed in with all of the other learned young men and old men of the Babylonian Empire. We find in chapter 2 that King Nebuchadnezzar had a nightmare. It was such an awful nightmare that it woke him up from his sleep and he couldn't go back to sleep. He called for all the wise men of his kingdom to come and tell him what this terrible dream was and explain to him what it meant. Well, as all the quote-unquote wise men from there in Babylon were brought in to him, they said, "King, tell us what the nightmare was. Tell us what the dream was, and we'll tell you the meaning of it." Nebuchadnezzar said, No, not so fast. If you can really do the things you say you can do, you tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me what it means. Then I'll know that you know what you're talking about, that you're not just making something up and trying to kill time while you figure things out. Well, they said to the king, no king has ever asked such a thing of his wise men before. And the king said, nevertheless, if you can't do it, you're a bunch of phonies and frauds, and you're all going to be killed. They said, we can't tell you what you dreamed. You tell us what you dreamed, and we'll tell you the meaning of it. And he said, not so. And he ordered them to all be killed. All the wise men throughout the entire empire, not just in the city of Babylon. Well, when Daniel and his companions heard that they and all the other wise men of the kingdom had been ordered to be killed, they asked why. After finding out why, Daniel asked for permission to have some time to pray and seek the Lord about the meaning of this dream that the king had. That brings us down now to where we left off last time. We read a little bit of it that I'm going to repeat right now. But we're in Daniel chapter 2. Look at verse 24 as we begin tonight. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. This is Daniel's name that had been changed into a Babylonian name, a Chaldean name, after one of the Babylonian gods, Bel. Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. Now, Daniel is saying here, there's no man who can reveal to the king what the king dreamed and what it means. That's something no man can do. But there's a God in heaven who can do that. And Daniel said that God is revealing to King Nebuchadnezzar what is going to be in the latter days. That is the end times. The latter days are the end times. He says in verse 29, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. So Daniel's saying, King, God is saying he's going to show you something he hasn't shown anyone else. He's choosing to reveal it to you, King Nebuchadnezzar. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Daniel is careful here to give God the credit for what's about to happen. And again, we're teaching through the book of Daniel here, but any teacher that's worth anything will do a little bit of preaching along the way, and here's one of those places we ought to look at. Daniel is careful to give God the credit for what's about to happen. And I have to think that's the reason God is going to continue to bless Daniel and do greater things for Daniel after this. Look at verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. All right, folks, if you'll look up here at our whiteboard, I'm going to attempt to give us a little bit of a picture of what Daniel said the king saw in his dream that night. Pay no attention to the drawing abilities of the preacher up here drawing the drawing. But here's a fella. He's probably got some kind of a headdress on. And here's the head. Here's the neck, the shoulders. Miss Mary, you're laughing at the preacher's drawing. I heard it already. You're not the only one. I have no doubt of that. Emily, I don't know what to think about people that would laugh at the preacher's drawings. No, I'm saying you. I didn't say you were laughing. You're on the preacher's side, right? She's just thinking how better she could do. She probably could, I'm sure. All right, so here is an image. The king in the dream saw an image of something that was likened to a statue of a man. The head was gold. The arms and the chest were silver. The belly was what metal? Brass. Same thing. Pretty close to being the same thing anyway. I don't know all of my metallurgy, but pretty close. Gold, silver, brass. The legs, iron. And then the feet were what two things mixed together? Iron and clay mingled together. All right, now let's look at it for a moment. I think we all know that of these metals, gold is considered the most valuable, precious metal. Silver is a precious metal, but a little less valuable than gold, actually. A lot less valuable, but still a precious metal. Then there's brass, which would come in third, like the bronze metal. Then there's iron. Iron is not known for its beauty. What is iron known for? Its strength, that's right. Its strength, its durability. Iron is strong. Then the feet. Iron mingled with clay. Think of a Georgia red clay dirt clod. Is it beautiful like gold and silver? No, it's just red Georgia clay. Is it strong like iron? Well, with the little bit of rain we had this past summer, it might have been like a brick. But generally speaking, clay, if you take the dirt clod and throw it on the pavement outside, it's going to explode into a million pieces there because clay is fragile and it breaks. Iron mixed with clay. The iron is strength, the clay is weakness. So it's strength and weakness mixed together. After seeing the statue made of all of these elements, King Nebuchadnezzar then in the dream saw a rock, a stone, that was cut out of the mountains, but not by hands. It was hewn, cut out, but not by hands. The stone smote the feet that were made of iron and clay. If you took a hard rock and you threw it against something that was iron and clay mixed together, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to shatter those feet, isn't it? Well, that's what happened. The stone in the dream hits these feet, and because of the clay being mixed in, the weakness causes the feet to just crumble. The stone then proceeds to pulverize all the other metals into just pieces. After it has pulverized all of these metals in the statues till the entire statue is nothing but pieces, the stone that was hewn out but not with human hands begins to grow. And it grows and grows until the stone is the size of a mountain. Picture Stone Mountain, if you would. And then the mountain continues to grow until it fills up the entire earth. Now, this is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that startled him and awakened him. Maybe it's just because it was such a strange dream that it was a nightmare. Or maybe the image was in the appearance of Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps. Whether it was or not, it awakened him. And it bothered him and disturbed him so much he couldn't go back to sleep. But he also couldn't remember the dream. That's the way I always am when I wake up. I never can remember 2 seconds later what I was dreaming before I awakened. He couldn't remember it, but it troubled him. That's why he wants to know what he dreamed and what the meaning is. Now, Daniel has already done something that no one else was able to do for the king. He told him what the dream was. But as Daniel's already told the king, it wasn't Daniel that was revealing it. It was God revealing it through Daniel. Now, let's find out what this dream means and the interpretation. Look at verse 36. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. Now let me stop right here. Is Nebuchadnezzar a king that worships the God of Israel? No. He's a pagan king. And the gods of the Babylonians trace their origin back to the Tower of Babel, the mystery religion of Babylon. He in no way worshipped or believed in the God of Israel. But Daniel is telling him, there's a God in heaven who gave you the kingdom that you have. You're a great king, Nebuchadnezzar, but God is the one who gave you your kingdom. Now think about it for just a moment. Here's Daniel, who's an Israelite, telling Nebuchadnezzar, who is the most powerful man anywhere in the world at that time, that the God of Israel gave you your kingdom. You can imagine that if this doesn't go exactly well, Daniel's probably going to lose his head here. But Daniel is bold. Daniel doesn't spare the king of saying what needs to be said. With boldness, Daniel tells him, you have your kingdom, O Nebuchadnezzar, because God, the God of Israel, gave you your kingdom. Verse 38. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. He said, King Nebuchadnezzar, you're a king of kings. The world admires you, but God gave you your kingdom. And you, Nebuchadnezzar, are this head of gold. He just told us here that this head of gold represents the kingdom of Babylon. So I'm going to put Babylon or Babylonian right out here to the side. This is the kingdom of Babylon, represented by the head of gold. Let's continue on. And after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Let's stop here for a moment. Daniel is telling King Nebuchadnezzar that these different parts of the image represent different kingdoms that will follow after one another. The first kingdom is the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kingdom, represented by the head of gold. He said next is coming a kingdom of silver, and a third of brass, followed by a fourth of iron. TR?
Never mind, I think I'm getting ahead of you. Never mind. Sorry.
Following the kingdom of iron will be a kingdom like iron and clay, partly strong and partly weak like clay. Then he talks about God setting up a kingdom on earth. A kingdom that will dash in pieces this one of iron and clay, and then will fill the whole earth. Daniel says it will not be given to other peoples. Now, the Babylonian Empire is going to be given to the next empire. And that empire will be given to the next empire, and so on, and we'll see those in just a moment. And then I'll call on you, TR. These kingdoms will be given one to another. As one falls, the next kingdom will take over the kingdom before it. But this kingdom of the Lord that will take up the whole earth will not be given to anyone. It will be an everlasting kingdom, a kingdom forever. So let's look at these kingdoms. The head of gold represents the Babylonian kingdom. TR, what kingdom or empire replaced Babylon as the next major world empire? Persia, that's right. The Persian Empire. Historically, that's exactly what happened. The Babylonian Empire declined, and the Medes and the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire. After the Persian Empire began to collapse, well, it collapsed because another kingdom, another empire, took it over militarily. the empire or the kingdom that took over the Persian Empire was one of the fastest spreading empires in all of world history. Greece, that's right. TR, you knew it too, but we'll let Miss Barbara have that one. Greece. And who was in charge of Greece as it conquered the known world at the time? Who was that general? Alexander the Great, that's right. Who in just a little more than 3 years' time conquered the known world. That's quite a feat. After Greece, another power became the world empire of the time. It was an empire that rose based primarily on the power and might of their iron weapons. And they ruled the known world with a fist of iron. Who was the empire that replaced Alexander the Great? The Romans, that's right. So Rome is signified by the two legs of iron. By the way, of interest, you remember that the Roman Empire was eventually divided into two parts as well. There was the Western Roman Empire, where Rome was continued to be the capital, and the Eastern Roman Empire, where Constantinople became the capital. It later became known as the Byzantine Empire. But Rome, the Roman Empire, signified by two legs of iron. This last one is a little bit of a mystery, though. A little bit of a mystery unless you know the rest of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. This last empire is an empire that is yet to come. It's the kingdom of the Antichrist. It's the kingdom that we'll see again in the book of Daniel described in the prophecies and again in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. The kingdom that the Antichrist will rule is referred to by many Bible scholars as the revived Roman Empire. And so that's what I'm going to write here. The revived Roman Empire. It will comprise much of the historical, geographical territory that Rome occupied as the Roman Empire. But the revived Roman Empire will be the seat of government of the Antichrist, where he does his bidding during the end times that are yet to come. We're going to see more of the revived Roman Empire in the book of Daniel. These are the things, the empires represented by the image. The stone that's cut out but not with human hands is a picture of who is the stone that the builders set at naught. Jesus is. That's what he's referred to in the New Testament. This stone that you see over here that's not made with hands, that's Jesus. Jesus is going to crush, destroy the kingdom of the Antichrist in the end times. This revived Roman Empire. And when Jesus has destroyed the kingdom of the Antichrist and the Antichrist, he's going to set up a kingdom that will encompass the entire earth. And that kingdom will have no end. It will last on this earth for 1,000 years. Then beyond that, there will be a new heaven and a new earth created, and it will continue on in complete perpetuity forever after that. That's Jesus. His kingdom that's set up covers the whole earth. Now, let's finish reading the chapter, and then I want us to do one last thing before we finish up tonight. Verse 46. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshiped Daniel. Did Daniel want to be worshiped, by the way? No. Daniel is giving God the credit. Daniel does not wish to be worshiped. But it says he worshiped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. That is, they should pray and offer a sacrifice to Daniel. The king answered unto Daniel and said, now listen, this is a pagan king, but look what he says. Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Those are some amazing words coming from a lost man. He said, Daniel, your God is a God of gods. I don't think that Nebuchadnezzar gets saved at this point. I don't think he accepts Daniel's God as his God at this point, but he realizes Daniel's God is different than the gods of Babylon. There's something different. He's beginning to realize it at this point. Mary?
Standing on your feet when you're Christian, and then sinners can look and watch you, and they can determine whether you are Christian or not.
You're right, Mary. Our example is supposed to point people to Jesus. That's exactly right. And if we do what we're supposed to, they will see Jesus, and they'll think the same thing about our God that Nebuchadnezzar thought about Daniel. Thanks for helping me with the preaching, Miss Mary. All right. Look what else he does after that. Then the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Now, the kingdom of Babylon encompassed a huge territory and many different peoples that had been conquered. But the city of Babylon was the capital. And the city of Babylon was in a province named Babylon. As I described on our first week meeting together, it was kind of like New York, New York. The city of New York in the state of New York. That's the same with Babylon. The city of Babylon was in the province of Babylon. And Daniel is made the governor over the whole province of Babylon. TR?
That's Nebuchadnezzar's home.
That's right. That's Nebuchadnezzar's home.
That's his home. It's Nebuchadnezzar's way of saying you're a trusted person in this nation.
That's right.
Kind of like Pharaoh trusted Joseph.
That's right. It was the most important place to Nebuchadnezzar because it was home. TR's right. So this is a position of great importance and great prestige that Nebuchadnezzar would give a man from Judah, a Hebrew, an Israelite, the governorship over the province of Babylon instead of giving it to a Babylonian. That's a great honor. But it doesn't stop there. It also says, and he also put him in charge of all the wise men of Babylon. Now that's all those soothsayers, astrologers, and magicians, all of those Chaldeans who were supposedly the wisest men in the whole empire. Daniel has been promoted and put over all of them. Now, I want you to remember this because it's going to come into play later on too. Surely there are some of these individuals that were older than Daniel and probably felt that this young fella shouldn't be in charge of everybody. There was also, I'm sure, by those who were born in Babylon, some animosity that an Israelite would be put in charge of the wise men of Babylon when he wasn't even a Babylonian. Keep all of that in mind. We'll come back to it. Verse 49. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Daniel said, King, if you're making me the governor of the province of Babylon, I'd like for these three fellows who prayed with me to be put over the affairs of the province. And so the king elevated Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to places of prominence as well. And Daniel sat in the king's gate. He was the number 2 man in the kingdom, right behind the king himself. That's an important place to be. Now, does anyone want to take a minute to jot any of this down before I erase it? All right, I'm going to erase this because I want us to see one other thing before we finish. What I'm going to attempt to draw for you here is a part of a timeline of history. We're not going to put the whole timeline of human history, but here's a part of it. Here is the kingdom of Babylon that was described by the head of gold, pictured, I should say, by the head of gold. It is going to be conquered, taken over, replaced by what empire? What empire? The Persian, that's right. In fact, we're going to see that occur during Daniel's lifetime. We'll see it before we leave the book of Daniel. The Persian Empire is then replaced when it's conquered by what empire? The Greeks, that's right. Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire will then be replaced by Rome, the Roman Empire. And it's the Roman Empire that's in control of the world at that time, all the way up to the birth of Christ. So all of these empires are in what we would call the Old Testament, or in history we call it BC, before Christ. So I'm going to put the cross right here, signifying both the birth as well as the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, because it's all pretty close together on the timeline here. Now, the Roman Empire will continue for several hundreds of years after the birth of Christ also. But that empire that we saw that was comprised of iron and clay, the feet of that image, that represents the kingdom of the Antichrist during the tribulation period to come, the revived Roman Empire. It didn't come right after the Roman Empire. All of these other kingdoms came one right after another, but not the kingdom represented by the feet and toes. It didn't come right after the Roman Empire, though it's partially like the Roman Empire. Instead, there's a gap in time, and then, after that gap in time, we will see the revived Roman Empire. The kingdom of the Antichrist. In the end times. Now, this is important to us because we want to know where we fit on the timeline, right? Well, we happen to fit somewhere in this area here. I don't know if we're here. We're somewhere in the middle of that, in that gap that's not pictured by Nebuchadnezzar's dream image. You say, why? Why is all of the history that's been going on from the end of the Roman Empire, which is about, does anybody know what date is usually given for the fall of the Roman Empire? Here's your history question for the day. A bonus question if anybody knows it. Nobody knows it. You should remember it. AD 476 is generally accepted as the fall of the Roman Empire. So from about 500 years after the birth of Christ, all the way through the time we live in is not even pictured by the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. Not until the end times, after the church has been raptured and the tribulation period begins with the kingdom of the Antichrist, not until then do we see the feet and toes, iron mingled with clay. Now we may see the beginnings of his kingdom, but the Antichrist will not be revealed until the Holy Spirit is taken out of the world. By the way, when the Holy Spirit is taken out of the world, I'm going to be taken out too, because He's in here. Amen? If you're saved, you have the Spirit living within you. That means when the Holy Spirit is taken out of this world, you and I don't have any choice but to go with Him, because He is our earnest, our down payment, a non-refundable down payment. So wherever He goes, I'm going too. So that means this is a big expanse of time. From about 500 to, well, today we're already past the year 2000. This is already more than 1,500 years in that gap that's not explained, not accounted for on Nebuchadnezzar's dream image. So here's the question that you're thinking, if you're thinking right now. Why did the prophet Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar not see this time space, this gap? Why did none of the other prophets in the Old Testament see that period of history? Well, I want to say this before I answer that. Nebuchadnezzar was the only one in the Old Testament who was even allowed to see this, and this. Nebuchadnezzar, who was not an Israelite, not a Judahite, he was allowed by God to see more of the history concerning Gentile nations than anybody else in history. God didn't even reveal that to any of the Old Testament prophets, only to a pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar. But for our benefit, I believe. But the question is, why do all those other Old Testament prophets not say anything about any of these Gentile nations or this gap leading up to the revived Roman Empire in the end times? They see a few events along the way, including Israel being allowed to rebuild the temple, some other events along the way that are just dots on the timeline. But they don't see this time that we live in from the cross up until the rapture of the church. There's at least 1,500 years that the Old Testament prophets didn't see and didn't explain. Here's the reason why. The Old Testament prophets who are writing are prophets to Israel. Almost all of them. Almost all of them are preaching to Israel, the Jews. So they're delivering messages from God, including prophecies from God, that deal with Israel. This time in which you and I live does not primarily deal at all with Israel. We're not saying that there aren't Jews alive today, descendants of Israel alive today, but God's not dealing primarily with Israel today. Who is God using today to do His work on earth? Not Israel like He did in the Old Testament. Gentiles? The church, which is made up mainly of Gentiles, not Jews. The Apostle Paul describes it in great detail in the book of Romans. that because the nation of Israel did not do in the Old Testament what God wanted them to do, God has set them temporarily on a shelf and said, okay, I'm going to use the church, made up of a bunch of Gentiles mainly that are not even a people, just a bunch of mutts and mongrels, a people that are not a people, and I'm going to use the church to reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. God is not today primarily using Israel. They're still sitting on the shelf. But the day is coming when the church is going to be taken out of this world, when the Holy Spirit is taken out. The rapture of the church. At that point, the church won't be here any longer to do God's work, and God is going to go back over to that shelf where He placed Israel, pick her up off the shelf, and once again begin to use Israel to reach the lost of the world in the end times, during that time of the revived Roman Empire. One last thing, and we'll stop for tonight. Here's the Old Testament prophet. He's standing over here. He's got his looking glass. He's looking out across history. He's standing on a mountaintop of Israel's history. He sees a great event in the history of Israel, and another great event in the history of Israel. And those things are prophesied about in the Old Testament. Eventually, he sees the revived Roman Empire and God picking back up with Israel in the end times. What he doesn't see is this valley down here below, which is the time in which we live. Daniel's going to give this name we live in a name a little bit later in the book of Daniel. I'm not going to give it to you yet. It's one of those golden nuggets you have to keep coming for. But these Old Testament prophets, they saw these mountaintop experiences in the history of Israel, but they didn't necessarily see what was going on in between the mountaintops in Gentile history. Nebuchadnezzar gets to see a little bit of this, a little bit of one of these valleys, but this time you and I live in is totally omitted from the dream image that he sees. But before we finish the book of Daniel, we're going to see more of it. And those things that are yet to come. We'll get more into the end times timeline a little later in the book of Daniel. But alas, my time is up for tonight. Hopefully this was enough of the prophecy, just a little bit of it, to whet your appetite for what's coming in the book of Daniel.